Ever feel like we're living through some crazy, unprecedented times? Like, every day the world's changing faster than,
It's funny you should say that because this feeling of living in unprecedented times, it's actually where Michiko Kakutani starts her book, The Great Wave.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she basically says everyone feels it, but then kind of flips the script.
Okay.
It's not unique to us. She points to all these other periods of massive upheaval throughout history, and she starts way back with the Black Death.
Oh, wow. Like back in the 1300s.
Exactly, the 14th century. Imagine like a world just ravaged by plague where the whole social order is just crumbling, and for the first time people are like, wait a minute, why are we doing things this way? There's this questioning of authority that hadn't really happened before on that scale.
It's like when the world feels like it's ending, you kind of have to question everything, right?
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that questioning, that whole period of upheaval, it actually set the stage for what we now think of as the modern world.
Yep.
It forced people to confront all these uncomfortable truths, rethink everything, like the systems they were living under. And you see this pattern again and again throughout history.
It's not just about like surviving the chaos, but about what comes out of it on the other side.
That's it. And it's not always pretty, right?
Mm.
But it's always transformative. Now let's jump ahead a few centuries to another era. Kakutani talks about the turn of the 20th century, the Gilded Age. It was this time of like crazy technological progress, globalization, and this constant tension between like clinging to the old ways and embracing the new. Does that sound familiar?
Totally. It's like our own world with a tech revolution, just everything's on fast forward now.
Right, and that's what makes her comparisons so compelling. So we've got these echoes of history playing out. But what about the people involved? Like, who are the major players that shape these periods of change?
Yeah, she talked about these rogue actors, right?
Yes, exactly. She points to figures like Putin, Zuckerberg, even Musk, all totally different, obviously. But what they have in common is they're all exploiting the instability of our time to gain power and influence. They operate outside the traditional power structures, which can be good or bad, but they definitely shake things up.
Well, I mean, look at how social media has like completely changed how we consume information these days.
Right.
How we even elect our leaders. It's insane.
Right, and that's exactly what makes these figures so fascinating, is their ability to kind of rewrite the rules of the game, often with these unintended consequences that nobody, not even they, could have predicted.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is. It reminds us that history is messy and full of surprises, and that understanding those patterns of upheaval and change is like essential if we're going to navigate the present.
Okay, so we've got these like rogue actors shaking things up.
Yeah.
But Kakutani doesn't stop there. She also goes deep on this idea of outsiders, like people in groups who actually thrive when the world is going through these periods of radical change.
Yeah, it's like the old rules don't apply to them. They've got this different playbook, and it somehow makes sense in the chaos. You know what I mean?
Totally. And she uses Steve Jobs and like the early days of Apple as a perfect example.
Right. Remember that whole think different thing? That wasn't just some marketing campaign. It was like deeply ingrained in their company culture, this pirate ethos. Like, they were the rebels, the underdogs going up against the giants of the tech world.
And they totally revolutionized the industry.
Right.
But in the book, she also kind of wonders if that same outsider spirit like ultimately backfired. Did they end up creating a new kind of establishment, even more powerful than the one they disrupted?
It's a really interesting question, and she connects it to this larger historical pattern of like technological upheaval. She actually draws a parallel between the printing press and the internet.
Whoa, okay, I can see where she's going with this.
Right. Both inventions, they like democratized information. They gave power to people outside the traditional gatekeepers. But they also both had these massive ripple effects, unintended consequences.
It's like opening Pandora's box.
Yeah.
Amazing potential, but also a whole lot of chaos.
Exactly. And Kakutani's point is that we need to be aware of that duality. Like, it's not enough to just celebrate the achievements of these outsiders. We also have to look at their impact long term.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's not just these big tech figures who can be these like unexpected agents of change, right? She also talks about what she calls accidental revolutionaries.
Oh yeah, the stories are powerful. Think about Darnella Frazier, the teenager who filmed George Floyd's murder, or Vanessa Guillen, whose death exposed all these horrible systemic problems in the military. These weren't activists or politicians, they were just everyday people caught in these extraordinary circumstances.
It's a good reminder that anyone can spark change even if they're not trying to. You know what I mean? And those stories, they often end up fueling these bigger movements, like what she calls leaderless movements.
Right, exactly. Think about Black Lives Matter, teacher strikes, even the war in Ukraine. These things are decentralized. They're often driven by technology. And it's more like this collective sense of urgency than any kind of top-down structure.
So the old rules of organizing don't really apply anymore. It's fascinating and also kind of hard to wrap your head around. So like, how does this new kind of movement change the game? What happens when it's the outsiders who are calling the shots? So we've got these rogue actors like really shaking things up. We've got outsiders rewriting all the rules and these movements that are like popping up out of nowhere. It's kind of exhilarating, but also kind of scary, do you think?
Yeah, it's a lot. And Kakutani doesn't shy away from that. She actually digs into another side of all this change that I think is really important, this idea of fragmentation. Like, are we actually becoming more divided than ever?
Totally. Yeah, it feels like everyone's retreating to their own little corners of the internet. Their own little echo chambers.
Exactly. And she sees this happening everywhere. Politically, we see it with this, like, hyper-partisanship, right?
Yeah.
The Overton window, that range of acceptable ideas, it's shrinking.
It's like we can't even agree on like the basic facts anymore.
Right. And then online, we're just constantly bombarded with information that's tailored to our existing biases. So it creates these echo chambers where it's like almost impossible to bridge that divide.
It's like we're all speaking different languages.
Yeah.
And it's not just in politics either. It feels like this fragmentation is seeping into like every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely. And the book highlights this too. She talks about how this decentralization of information and power, it's impacting everything, like from how we consume news to how artists connect with their audiences, even like how financial systems operate. It's like this double-edged sword.
Totally. So how do we deal with that? Like, how do we navigate this new world? Is there a way to harness the good parts of this decentralization without falling prey to all the negative stuff?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I don't think Kakutani pretends to have all the answers, but she does offer a really powerful reminder. She says that resilience and adaptability, those are key.
Right.
Like, not just for surviving, but for actually thriving in this era of constant change.
So it's not enough to just like hold on for dear life. We have to learn how to surf those waves.
Exactly. And she gives some really compelling examples too, like the recovery efforts after Fukushima and after 9/11. Like, even when everything seems completely broken, societies can still come together and rebuild.
It's a good reminder that there's always hope, even in those really dark moments. But what about on a personal level? Like, what can we take away from all of this as individuals?
You know, instead of ending with like a neat and tidy answer, Kakutani leaves us with this really provocative question. She asks, what role will you play in this era of radical disruption?
Ooh, I like that. It's like a call to action.
Yeah, it's a challenge to figure out how we're each going to navigate this moment in history. Are we going to get swept away by the current, or are we going to find a way to ride the wave and maybe even steer it in a new direction?
I love that.
Yeah.
So there you have it, our deep dive into Michiko Kakutani's The Great Wave. Hopefully this conversation gave you some new things to think about, some new questions to ponder,
Yeah,
and maybe even a little bit of hope for the future.
definitely. It's a wild ride, but it's not over yet.
Not by a long shot. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep riding that wave of curiosity.